You're with the Sound of Ideas from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thank you for staying with us. Shipwrecks in the Great Lakes are not uncommon. Historians and archaeologists have estimated that there have been more than 6,000 shipwrecks across Lakes Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, and Superior. But perhaps none have captured the attention and the imagination quite like the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which went down 50 years ago today. 29 sailors lost their lives that day when the ship was caught in a storm on Lake Superior. The new book, Wrecked, the Edmund Fitzgerald and the Sinking of the American Economy, examines not only the tragedy of the ship sinking, but what it means in the larger context of economic change in the Great Lakes region. We have the author Tom Nelson with us now by phone, who is also the county executive of the Outagamie County in Wisconsin. Tom, welcome to the Sound of Ideas.
Great to be on. Thanks for having me.
Now, if you would like to join the conversation, you can give us a call at 866-578-0903. Maybe you're old enough to remember when the sinking happened, or maybe you have questions about it. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org or send us a message on Instagram at The Sound of Ideas. Now, Tom, I know like many of us, you grew up hearing the Gordon Lightfoot song about the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald on the radio. But there was another experience that actually sparked your interest in the shipwreck. Tell us about that.
Well, there's there's actually two. One, my trip to the Valley Cat Museum in Sault Ste. Marie. I was about 7 years old, and going to the Fitzgerald exhibit, and specifically as a 7-year-old, maybe 4 feet tall, walking up to the lifeboat that they have on display. And of course, the lifeboat is just kind of pulled apart along the stern, as if a large can opener had just ripped it open. And from my size, it just looked like the shark was trying to engulf me, just to chew me up. And so that sat with me for years. But as you mentioned, being county executive in Outagamie County, before that as a state legislator, and taking an interest in economic issues, labor studies, and so forth, I couldn't help but put two and two together, that the Fitzgerald was more than a tragedy, it was more than a shipwreck, but a vehicle that literally and figuratively built the American economy. And so my book is specifically about that legacy. And also in researching the legacy and writing this book, I also found what I think to be a very compelling theory why it sank in the first place.
We'll be getting into that in just a moment. I do want to ask you a little bit more about the framing and the context of the economic piece of the Great Lake region in the mid-'70s. You could have framed this book in a lot of ways. So why did you choose to frame it that way?
Well, I think because it was an original approach to it. No one had written about it. I think it matched my interest and my experience well. And so when I did a tour in Cleveland and Toledo and a few other places, and I was talking about this and explaining the concept and some of the research, the evidence, the interviews that I conducted and dug up, people are like, wait. This stuff goes back to 1977, for the example of the Red Bergner deposition. Why haven't we heard about this? And I think most people who have been attracted to the Fitzgerald, who have written about the Fitzgerald, are people who are attracted to shipwrecks and maritime history. And so they've been asking one set of questions. With the economic and political background that I have, I've been asking an entirely different set of questions. And so that led me into a much different direction, and the result of which is this book.
A main premise of the book is that the Edmund Fitzgerald wasn't really seaworthy in 1975 when it sank, and it launched in 1958. And when that happened, it was the largest ship on the Great Lakes. So tell us a little bit, how did things evolve between the launch in 1958 and then the sinking in 75, and how you came to the conclusion that it wasn't safe to be on the water when it went down?
Well, based on my interviews and my research, there were several problems. From the very beginning, the design was faulty, that it took the design of a smaller ship and basically elongated it. And you don't take, for example, a civil engineer doesn't take a design for a 30-foot-long bridge and elongate it to 50 feet. Like, that just doesn't happen because it's not sound structurally. Over the course of the Fitzgerald life, things started kind of falling apart, and in particular, the keel. And in its latter years, the keel, which should have been rebuilt or replaced, was simply patched together tack welded with pieces of steel. And there is a deposition that was conducted in 1977 that makes that very, very clear. And in that setting, the companies did not necessarily contest that conclusion. And one of the reasons why the ship was ill-maintained, so it's one thing to say there's evidence that it was ill-maintained, but then the question is, why was it ill-maintained? There were 4 ore ships on Lake Superior that night. There was the Fitzgerald. In addition to Fitzgerald, there was the Anderson, the Sykes, and the Ford. What the latter 3 have in company in common is that they were owner operator. So those are vertically integrated companies, Ford, U.S. Steel, and then Inland Steel. And with the example of the Fitzgerald, it was not integrated. It was not owner operator. There was Northwestern Mutual that built the ship, paid for it, and then there was Ogilvy Norton that operated it. In other words, the Fitzgerald was a rental.
We have a call now from John from Lima, who has something he'd like to add to the conversation about the Anderson. John, welcome to the Sound of Ideas. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just found fascinating about the captain of the Anderson, which I guess was ahead of the Edmund Fitzgerald when it went down. And the captain of the Anderson had 40-plus years of ocean experience. He'd been in the Indian Ocean and around the world. And what he said was that he had never seen a storm as fierce as what come upon Lake Superior that day.
Thank you for the comment, John. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that storm was a force to reckon with. And John is exactly right, that it was a storm that I think for people that had been on the lake before, at least recently around that time, in contemporary times, that it seemed like it was unprecedented. With the example of the Anderson left that night unscathed. The Anderson was approximately 10 miles behind the Fitzgerald. Now, any ordinary lake, if 2 boats are separated by 10 miles, I mean, that's 10 miles. That's a long distance. But when you're talking about the second largest lake in the world, 10 miles apart, they're basically on top of each other, experiencing the same weather and the same effects of the weather. One goes down and the other one does not. Now, there are a number of control variables, but one thing is clear is the Anderson was well kept. The Anderson was owned and operated by the same company, and the Anderson today still plies the Great Lakes, despite the Fitzgerald going down 50 years ago. So John makes a really good point. Yes, the weather was a factor, but I contend that if it wasn't on the night of November 10th, 1975, it was only a matter of time before the Fitzgerald would in fact still sink.
Tom, let's talk about what happened on November 10th in 1975. We talked about the storm that day. So what can you tell us about the direct ruling of the cause of the shipwreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald?
Well, that's the problem with this, is that there was never a direct ruling. And from the very beginning, and this was a clear signal to the people interested in this, especially the families affected by it, that this was going to be a political football, because there were 2 main reports by the Coast Guard and the NTSB. They were in conflict with each other and both discounted each other's respective report. And so there really wasn't anything clear about that. Meanwhile, you have later that year, 1976, you have Gordon Lightfoot coming out with his song. And in his song, it speaks to the main hatches giving way. And so the hatch theory persisted for 4 years. In 1980, when Jacques Cousteau's son, when his team dove the Fitzgerald for like all of 30 minutes because the battery power went out on the submersible vehicle, he had said, well, it was, it broke apart at the surface and it was because of the hatches. So there was even more disagreement within the community, and that maintained for another 9 years until it was dove again. So for years and years, there has never been anything conclusive saying why it sank. And I think that's the reason that attracts people to this issue, because it remains a mystery, because there hasn't been anything officially concluded from the wreckage.
I want to remind our audience that we're talking about the 50th anniversary of the sinking of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. Our guest is Tom Nelson. He's the author of Wrecked, the Edmund Fitzgerald and the Sinking of the American Economy. That's a new book that's out now. If you have a question or a comment, you can give us a call at 866-578-0903. You can also send us an email at soi@ideastream.org, or you can send us a message on Instagram at The Sound of Ideas. Now, Tom, in the book, you talk about the profit-driven nature of shipping on the Great Lakes in the 70s. So what kind of blame do you put on the shipping companies that operated ships like the Fitzgerald at that time?
Well, I'll say two things. One, to put things in context, how the shipping industry operated in the 1970s was not unlike any other manufacturing industry, be it the paper industry, auto industry, steel industry. There was an incredible amount of foreign competition, and there was a reckoning happening within manufacturing in general. So I think that companies were really hamstrung and that there was remarkable competition domestically as well as foreign. But look, these companies were in the business of making money, okay? OSHA was established 1973, 1974, so right before the Fitzgerald went down, but too little, too late. And so focusing on worker protections, the U.S. government shoring up, so to speak, industry that had fallen on hard times, that was losing out to foreign competition because the U.S. government still did not have, and still does not today, by the way, have a national industrial strategy. These companies were really hamstrung. But specifically focusing on Ogilvy Norton, their business model was different than other shipping companies, shipping, steel, and manufacturing companies, especially compared to the other three ore ships that were on the lake. So I would say two things. One, Ogilvy Norton was not exceptional in this regard, but they clearly cut corners that really set things in motion that the Fitzgerald would ultimately meet its demise on Lake Superior.
Now, Tom, you talked with a lot of people as you were preparing to write the book, Wrecked. So tell us about some of the people you interviewed for it and how those voices helped paint a more complete picture of what actually happened with the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
Well, first of all, despite the fact that this story is 50 years old, I interviewed a lot of people that no one bothered to interview before. I asked interview subjects questions that had never been asked before. The three attorneys that I interviewed, plus a law firm investigator, painted a picture that was much different than a narrative that has persisted over the years. So I'd like to think that I gave those people a voice, gave them space to be able to tell their story. And in telling their story, revealing facts, revealing information, and taken together, I would say, a compelling theory about the underlying cause of why the Fitzgerald sank.
We have a call now from Kelly in Aurora. Kelly, welcome to the Sound of Ideas. Go ahead.
Hi, I lived in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, the night of the storm. I'm a Coast Guard brat. My father was in the Coast Guard and the life-saving service, and I just wanted to make a comment about that night. It was truly one of the worst storms I have ever been in or that any of my group had seen. It was so bad that windows were imploding along the street. My friend who lived in the country had a ladder go through his window, and we didn't know the ship went down until the next morning when we went to a local restaurant, and it was full of rescue people, and that's how we found out that the Fitzgerald went down.
Oh, wow. Thank you very much for sharing that with us, Kelly. We appreciate you sharing that first-person perspective of the experience of the storm that night. Tom, I'll ask you before we wrap things up here. We are the NPR member station coming out of Cleveland here on The Sound of Ideas. So can you tell us about the Ohio connection specifically? Had the Edmund Fitzgerald docked in many Ohio ports, and were there any Ohio sailors on board when it went down?
Most of the sailors were, in fact, from, or I should say, of all the states represented, I think Ohio was number 2 or number 3, perhaps number 1 as well. When I was in Ohio over the weekend, I was struck just how engaged people were in general on this topic. And it wasn't just because that was my focus doing these book talks, though. It was almost like the anniversary of the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald was practically a national holiday. The nickname of the Fitzgerald, and it had several, was the Toledo Express because its route was Silver Bay, Minnesota to Toledo. And so it would unload in Toledo, and there were a couple of families that lived there throughout the year because their loved ones would come into port once every 2 weeks or so. And then the taconite ore taken from that would go to steel mills in Ohio and northern Kentucky. What should be noted is the Fitzgerald left from Superior, Wisconsin, headed for Zog Island in Detroit, which was not its normal route. And this goes back to, I think, 2 questions ago. It was actually carrying for National Steel. That was the route that National Steel had carried. And the reason why the Fitzgerald was doing that is there was a mutual aid arrangement of sorts among the carrying companies that if they needed a load from up lake, down lake, and they didn't have any equipment up there, if they didn't have a ship, they would contract or they have an agreement with another company to do that. And so that's actually what the Fitzgerald was doing that night. But Ohio, I would say Ohio, Michigan, and to a lesser extent Minnesota were really the top states that were affected by the Fitzgerald more than anyone else.
Tom, your book is available now. Can you tell people where they can get it if they're interested in learning more?
Well, first of all, I'd have to say and give a plug for Coventry Books because they were so kind to have me do a talk on Saturday. You can also go to the Michigan State University Press website and, of course, Amazon. But yes, I'd say first and foremost, do patronize your local bookstores. We need to support them, but it's relatively accessible around the internet.
All right. Tom Nelson, author of Wrecked, The Edmund Fitzgerald and the Sinking of the American Economy, and county executive in Outagamie County in Wisconsin. Thank you very much for being with us on The Sound of Ideas today.
Great to be on. Thank you.